6,000 men crucified along 180 kilometers, one behind the other, from Capua to the gates of Hami. Among the 50,000 corpses that lay scattered across the battlefield, the body of the man who had humiliated the Republic for 3 years was never identified. This is the story of the last battle of Spartacus and of how his death sentenced the end of Republican Rome. Winter of the year 71 before Christ. The cold lashes the peninsula of Calabria, and an army of slaves gazes at the horizon with desperation ahead. The sea, behind, a gigantic ditch that cuts the land from coast to coast. Spartacus and his men are trapped like rats. How had they reached that point? The answer is simple: betrayal. Spartacus had designed a brilliant plan. Sicily, that was the key. On that island, not long before, the slaves had staged another revolt. The Thracian leader knew that if he managed to cross the strait and join forces with the Sicilian rebels, Rome would have a devastating problem on its hands. So he hired Cilician pirates to transport his men to the other side of the sea. But the pirates had other plans. They accepted the money, took everything, and disappeared on the horizon without looking back. Spartacus and his army were left stranded on the coast, watching as their hopes sailed away with the sails of those treacherous ships. The rebel leader did not give up. He ordered the construction of homemade boats, improvised vessels, with which to attempt the crossing. It was useless. The currents of the strait were too strong, the boats too fragile. The Sicily plan was discarded forever. And while Spartacus searched for alternatives, Marcus Licinius Crassus worked tirelessly. The Roman praetor, a potentate eager for glory and fortune, had received command of 8 legions with a single mission to crush the slave revolt that had been humiliating Rome for 3 years. Crassus was not a man who left anything to chance. He knew that Spartacus was dangerous, unpredictable, capable of defeating entire consular armies, so he designed a trap from which no one could escape. 30 kilometers, that was the length of the palisade he ordered, built from coast to coast, cutting the tip of the Italian boot in two. A deep ditch accompanied the structure. The objective was devastating in its simplicity: to force the rebels to surrender by hunger, with no possibility of advancing north, without ships to cross south, surrounded by land and sea. The slaves would die of starvation, without Rome having to risk a single legion more. But Crassus was not the only general Rome had set in motion. The Republic, terrified by the magnitude of the revolt, had called upon its best commanders. Pompey marched from Hispania with his veterans. Lucullus sailed from Macedonia with his legions. 3 armies converging on a single objective. 3 pincers closing on Spartacus. The siege seemed perfect, implacable, definitive. And then the snowstorm arrived. The night was brutal. The wind howled, dragging snowflakes that blinded anyone who dared open their eyes. The Roman sentries could barely see their own hands. The torches went out again and again. The cold pierced to the bone. Spartacus saw it clearly. It was now or never. Under the mantle of that storm, the Thracian leader organized his men in silence. Thousands of slaves advancing in the darkness, carrying everything they could, heading toward the palisade that kept them prisoners. The Romans saw nothing, heard nothing. When they wanted to react, it was already too late. The rebels crossed the ditch and the palisade through the massif of Aspromonte. Crassus's trap had been mocked. The slave army was free again. But here something happened that changed the course of events. The rebel troops became emboldened. They had escaped a deadly trap. They had mocked the feared Crassus. They had once again shown that Rome could not stop them. Their men wanted blood. They wanted direct confrontation with the legions. They wanted to end that war once and for all. Spartacus was a strategist. He knew exactly what it meant to face the combined armies of Crassus, Pompey, and Lucullus. That was suicide. 3 Roman generals with tens of thousands of veteran legionaries against an army of poorly equipped slaves. The mathematics were devastating. His plan was different, smarter to eliminate them one by one, starting with the closest and most weakened, and that was precisely Crassus. The praetor had spent enormous resources on the construction of the palisade. His troops had been camped for weeks in hostile territory, waiting for a surrender that never came. He was the weakest link in the chain. If Spartacus managed to defeat him before Pompey and Lucullus arrived, the chances of victory increased considerably. So the Thracian leader directed his army toward Lucania, ready to face Crassus in open field. But Spartacus had an alternative plan. Brundisium, the great port of the Adriatic, if he managed to capture its ships, he could cross to Greece with his army, escape from Italy forever, and leave behind that endless war. And then he did something unexpected. He sent emissaries to Crassus. He offered his surrender, but not just any surrender. Spartacus proposed to become a client of the Roman praetor. In exchange for his loyalty, he would avoid punishment. It was a bold move. In the Roman system, clientele was a relationship of mutual obligations between a powerful patron and a subordinate. Spartacus offered his sword in exchange for his life. Crassus rejected the offer. The praetor did not want pax. He wanted glory. He wanted the triumph that Rome reserved for the great conquerors, and to achieve it, he needed to crush Spartacus on the battlefield, destroy him completely, without negotiations, without mercy. Crassus's answer sealed the fate of both armies. Spartacus marched toward Brundisium with the hope of finding ships, but when his scouts sighted the walls of the port, the hope vanished. Lucullus's legions had already arrived from Macedonia. The city was garrisoned. There was no possible escape by sea. With Crassus pursuing them from the west and Lucullus blocking the east, the slaves took the only route left to march toward Rome along the coast. The final encounter was inevitable, and Crassus knew it. Marcus Licinius Crassus had been waiting for that moment for months. He had built ditches. He had raised palisades. He had pursued the rebels across the entire peninsula. He had endured the veiled mockery of the Senate, the humiliating comparisons with the consuls that Spartacus had defeated before, but now he finally had what he had always desired, an opportunity to face the slave leader in pitched battle, and he did not intend to waste it. The chosen place was the valley of the Silarus River, near present day Salerno, an open terrain where the discipline of the Roman legions could deploy in all its splendor. Crassus risked everything in that decisive confrontation. There would be no more pursuits, no more maneuvers, only steel against steel. Spartacus also knew that this was the end. Before the combat, the Thracian leader did something that left both his men and the Roman spies watching from a distance astonished. He took his own horse, the animal that had accompanied him throughout the campaign, and slit its throat in front of his army. The message was devastating. In its clarity, there would be no flight, no retreat. Spartacus would fight to the death or die in the attempt. There was no middle ground. The ancient sources record succinctly what happened next. Appian and Plutarch, the two historians who narrated these events, offer slightly different versions but coincide in the essentials. According to Plutarch, Spartacus fought with a bravery that bordered on madness. His objective was not simply to resist the Roman attack, no. The Thracian leader wanted something much bolder, to open a path through the enemy lines until reaching Crassus himself. To kill him, to decapitate the Roman army by eliminating its general. Spartacus charged directly toward the proconsul. His most faithful men followed him, forming a human wedge that tried to pierce the legionary formation. The Romans fell under his sword, but for every one he knocked down, two more took his place. According to Appian, at some point in that desperate charge, a Roman javelin struck Spartacus in the leg. The weapon pierced the muscle, embedding itself deeply. Any other man would have fallen. Any other man would have been captured or finished. Off on the ground, Spartacus was not any other man. Wounded, bleeding, unable to stand, he continued fighting, surrounded by Roman swords, striking with his own until his arms stopped responding. until his body finally gave way. The leader of the greatest slave revolt that Rome had known fell somewhere on that battlefield, but his body was never identified with certainty. Among the thousands of corpses that covered the valley of the Silarus, none could be definitively pointed out as that of the feared Thracian gladiator. The Roman swords tore him apart until he was unrecognizable. His own men dragged him in a last attempt to protect his remains. We will never know. What we do know is that Crassus searched for that body with desperation. He needed it as proof of his victory and never found it. Meanwhile, the battle continued its bloody course. The arrival of Pompey from Rome ended up deciding the encounter. His fresh troops fell upon the slaves who tried to flee, closing any escape route. The Roman cavalry pursued the fugitives without mercy, striking them down one after another. When the sun set over the valley of the Silarus, the battlefield was a cemetery. Of the 50,000 slaves that had formed Spartacus's army, only 6,000 survived. Almost the entire rebel army had been annihilated in a few hours of combat. But for those 6,000 survivors, the nightmare had only just begun. The 6,000 slaves captured after the Battle of the Silarus surely wished they had died alongside their companions. The fate that awaited them was infinitely worse. Crassus ordered them all crucified, but not just anywhere. Not in some forgotten corner where the message would go unnoticed. The praetor chose the most public, most trafficked, most impossible to ignore setting in all of Italy, the Via Appia, the great road that connected Rome with Capua, the main artery through which merchants, soldiers, senators, and citizens of the entire republic circulated. 180 kilometers of crosses, one behind the other. Every few meters, a man agonizing. 6,000 bodies writhing under the sun, dying slowly of asphyxia, thirst, and pain. Crucifixion was a death designed to prolong suffering. Some took days to expire, and during all that time, their screams accompanied anyone who traveled along the road. The message of Rome was clear, brutal, categorical. This is what awaits those who dare to challenge the established order. Look well, remember well, never forget. Crassus contemplated his work with satisfaction. He had achieved his objective. He had crushed the greatest slave revolt in Republican history. He had defeated the enemy that 3 years earlier had humiliated the Roman consuls. Now he awaited his reward. The triumph, the most prestigious ceremony that Rome could offer to a victorious commander, a parade through the streets of the city with the prisoners in chains. The booty displayed before the people, the commander dressed in the purple toga of Jupiter, absolute glory. But the Senate had other plans. They granted him a triumph, they gave him an ovation. A minor celebration, almost humiliating compared to what he expected. The praetor had risked his fortune, his reputation, and his life to crush Spartacus. And Rome gave him in return a pat on the back. The reason Pompey, the general who had arrived from Hispania just in time to participate in the Battle of the Silarus, did not settle for a secondary role. After the main combat, his troops pursued and executed all the fugitives who had escaped the encirclement, and Pompey made sure that Rome knew exactly who had finished off the revolt. The Senate, always attentive to the balances of power, hastened to recognize Pompey's contribution. They did not want to hurt the susceptibility of a general who commanded veteran legions and enjoyed immense popularity among the people. The result was devastating for Crassus. Pompey had taken part of the glory from him, the man who had spent months pursuing Spartacus, who had built palisades and ditches, who had risked everything in the definitive battle, had to share the recognition with someone who arrived at the end to collect the laurels. The rivalry between both generals intensified to dangerous limits, and that rivalry would light the fuse that would destroy the Republic. Once the campaign against Spartacus was over, Pompey made a decision that would change the history of Rome forever. He refused to disband his troops. The legions that had marched from Hispania remained under his command. Camped at the gates of the capital, it was a veiled but unequivocal threat, an instrument of coercion against the Senate. Pompey wanted to be elected consul, the highest magistracy of Rome, and his soldiers were the most convincing argument. Crassus, who knew perfectly the rules of that power game, did exactly the same. He did not intend to be at a disadvantage against his rival. His legions also remained mobilized, ready to intervene if necessary. Armies, two ambitious generals, and a Senate that watched horrified as the Republic teetered on the edge of the abyss. The most revealing thing of all was that, according to the Cornelian law, only Crassus met the requirements to aspire to the consulship. Pompey had never held the previous magistracies that the law required. He had not been praetor, he had not been quaestor, and he did not reach the minimum age of 43 years required for the position. He was 34. But to Pompey, the law mattered exactly the same as his legions were willing to respect nothing, his great army, his aura of victorious general. His popularity among the Roman people, all that, weighed infinitely more than any legal requirement. The Senate knew it, and the Senate yielded. Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls jointly, two men who detested each other, who had spent months disputing the glory of having defeated Spartacus, now sharing the highest magistracy of Rome. It was an explosive situation. A time bomb. The grudges between them continued throughout their term. The tension was constant. The Senate tried to mediate, to balance, to maintain peace between two monumental egos, but the situation was unsustainable. Until someone proposed an unexpected solution. Julius Caesar, the future conqueror of the Gauls, the future perpetual dictator, saw an opportunity in that destructive rivalry. Why confront each other when they could share power? He proposed to Pompey and Crassus an agreement that would benefit the three, a secret alliance outside the institutions, a pact that would allow them to control Rome without the need to destroy each other. The first triumvirate had been born. It was a completely illegal agreement, a private pact between three powerful men who decided the fate of millions without consulting the Senate or respecting the laws of the Republic. Rome, the city that prided itself on its system of government, on its magistracies, on its centuries-old traditions, was left at the mercy of three military leaders. The victory over Spartacus had sown the seeds of destruction. Rome considered itself victorious. The Senate celebrated the crushing of the revolt. The citizens slept peacefully, knowing that the slaves had been punished exemplarily. No one seemed to understand what had really happened. To the death of Spartacus would very soon follow the death of the Republic. The body of Spartacus was never found. Perhaps that is the most appropriate: a man who challenged the established order, who humiliated the consular armies, who for 3 years made the greatest power of the Mediterranean tremble, disappearing without a trace among the corpses of his companions. But his legacy endured in ways he never imagined. The rivalry that his war unleashed between Crassus and Pompey poisoned Roman politics for decades. The triumvirate that was born from that rivalry destroyed the Republican institutions, and barely 20 years after the Battle of the Silarus, Rome burned in civil wars that would culminate with the birth of the empire. A Thracian slave who fought to the death for his freedom ended up, without knowing it, changing the course of Western history. 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way were the warning of Rome to the world. But the world remembered something very different. It remembered the man who slit the throat of his own horse before charging against an army of legionaries, the gladiator who continued fighting with a javelin piercing his leg, the leader who preferred to die on his feet rather than live on his knees. And that, my Roman delegate friends, no cross could erase. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most brutal and fascinating pages of ancient history. If you want to discover more hidden secrets of the Roman world, take a look at the channel. See you in the next project.